Alright, so today I want to compare the two genes, the butter gene versus the lesser gene in ball pythons. And let me tell you, people have been debating this for probably over 10 years. Is the butter and the lesser the same gene, or are they two completely separate genes that are compatible? Both of them are in the blue-eyed leucistic, and both of them can vary quite a bit from one example to the other. And I say there's two different camps. There's some people on one side that say, yes, I know for sure, for a fact, that the butter and lesser are the same exact genes, and you have just the opposite, where a lot of people, as a matter of fact, a lot of people say the butter can be a little bit brighter than the lesser and can make some subtle differences within the combinations when you mix it in. And the interesting thing is with the butter and the lesser, there's a lot of variability within the genes. So you can have really bright butters and you can have kind of browned out butters, and it's kind of the same thing with the lesser. So I'm going to jump over the internet and I want to compare these two genes, the butter and the lesser. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here at Morphmarket.com, and I want to start with this snake right here. This is a butter. I should say this is what one version of the butter looks like. And if you actually take a look at this snake, this is really bright and flashy with a high contrast and a lot of bright yellows. It's pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, I was actually looking for a lesser that was kind of comparable to this, and I'd say I really couldn't find a lesser that was as bright and flashy as this butter. And sometimes it's really hard to compare. There's a lot of different variations of each gene. And take a look at this. I actually pulled up another butter here. This is one of the darker butters. Look at how dark this is compared to the other one. And I would say it really depends on what you're shooting for in combination. So for example, if you wanted to add butter to some of your darker combinations, so if you went kind of the dark side with like GHI or blackhead or black pastel, I would think, adding a darker butter to the mix would probably be better because you'd have a darker background, versus if you use the lighter butter, you're actually working on the light genes, like the Orange Dream, the Pastel, and the Fire, and you add the lighter butter to it, you'd probably get more of a bright and flashy snake. So I don't think necessarily one is better than the other. It really depends on kind of the projects you're working on. As a matter of fact, it might be good to have both, the darker butter and the lighter butter, and you can actually kind of pick and choose depending on what project you're actually working on. So take a look at this. I actually pulled up a lesser, and this is pretty much the brightest lesser that I could find over here. Pretty bright and flashy, really comparable to the butter. As a matter of fact, if we go back and look at the butter, I'd say the butter, in this case, actually, I think the butter wins out as far as brightness and contrast. As a matter of fact, I actually saw on some older reptile forums, a lot of people thought that the butter had not as much contrast as the lesser, and I'd say it's really variable from one snake to another. It really varies. It kind of jumps around. So here's like the brightest lesser that I found over here in Morph Market. I actually found a dark one. Take a look at this. This is pretty amazing. This is a super dark lesser. As a matter of fact, I couldn't find a butter that was as dark as the darkest lesser, although there are, there's quite a bit of variation, and as a matter of fact, there's actually more lessers over here than butter. So sometimes it's hard to compare one gene directly to another. So if you actually take the lesser and you breed it to a butter, take a look at this. You actually get this snake right here. This is a blue-eyed leucistic, which is an all-white snake with blue eyes. So if you actually made a super lesser with two copies of lesser, or you made a super butter by breeding two butters together, you would still get the all-white snake. So it seems like they are almost, a lot of people can consider them the same thing because they're in the blue-eyed leucistic, although there's a lot of different genes in the blue-eyed leucistic that'll make a white snake. There is the lesser, the butter, the Mojave, the special, the mystic, the phantom, the bamboo, all those genes. You mix it with lesser or butter and you get the all-white snake with bright blue eyes. So here is one of the problems. As a matter of fact, if you actually kind of cross these two genes and you make the lesser butter and you breed it to something else, here's kind of something you can run into as it can be a little bit problematic. You can actually make some snakes that look like a lesser and a butter, and you don't know which is which. And a lot of times people come over here and they'll label them as lesser / butter because it came from that blue-eyed leucistic that contains the lesser and the butter. And sometimes if you actually mix genes together that are really close, close, and then you kind of breed them, and then the offspring are kind of listed as, you know, kind of, you don't know which one's which. You don't know if it's lesser or butter, and then a lot of people kind of group them together saying this is a lesser slash butter, which, you know, kind of leads people to think, all right, if it's a lesser slash butter, that means that these two genes are the same, right? Because we're listing it as a lesser slash butter. And I don't necessarily think that is the case. I think that depends on the breeding, where it originated from. So this one, I can almost guarantee it probably originated from a blue-eyed leucistic containing one copy of the lesser and one copy of the butter. So I actually wanted to show you how many lessers and how many butters are over here on Morph Market. I actually came over here and sorted just by lesser and all the ones that are for sale and that have sold. And there's actually 9,856 lesser and lesser combinations over here on Morph Market. So almost 10,000 lessers. And if you actually compare that to butters, take a look at this. This is 4,732, just about half as many butters as there are lessers. So it's kind of hard to actually compare them side by side, since there's twice as many lessers as there are butters. But you know, there's so many over here, there's quite a few to choose from either the lessers or the butters. As a matter of fact, you know, years ago, I was actually looking at some old forums about 10 years ago, and everyone's like, oh yeah, you should actually invest in the butter because there's not as many butters and it's a better investment. And now they're pretty much the same price, the lesser and the butter. So I actually wanted to show you some other genes that we can mix in the lesser and the butter to kind of see the influences, see if we can see a difference between the lesser and the butter worked into some of these genes. And the first one I want to show you is the spider. And it's kind of an interesting anomaly when you work either lesser or butter into the spider. You get a snake that almost looks like it's a xanthic, almost like a black and white snake. I'd say it's kind of like a poor man's axanthic. It looks almost like an axanthic, but it doesn't have, you know, the two copies of the recessive axanthic gene. It just has lesser and spider. So here's what happens if you work spider into the butter. Take a look at this. If you actually handed me the snake, I'd say, yeah, that looks like a pretty interesting axanthic, and it can kind of trick you. This is actually called the butter bee with the butter and the spider. And it's kind of interesting on this one, if you actually compare it to the lesser version of the butter bee. I'll actually pull that one up over here. This is pretty amazing. In this case, the lesser is actually a lot more defined and a lot cleaner than the butter bee. If you actually look at the butter bee, it almost looks like it has kind of a creamy, almost like a ghost-like appearance with the ghost gene in the mix. And that's what a lot of people were saying. They thought the butter was a little more kind of washed out compared to the lesser. But I've seen pretty much both of them, you know, back and forth. Some of them have a higher contrast, and some of them are kind of washed out and have like a ghost-like appearance. So I'm not sure if you can actually tell, you know, which one is really different in this version. It seems like almost the opposite when we were looking at the butter and the lesser. In the first place, it looked like the butter had the higher contrast, and in this case, it looks like the lesser spider has more contrast than the butter version. So here is the pinstripe. The pinstripe's one of my favorite genes. It's actually a really bright gold snake, almost looks metallic, and has this really strong stripe right down the top of the snake. And if you actually work pinstripe into the lesser, you actually get what is known as the kingpin. And it's kind of interesting, on a lot of these slang names, you're talking about kingpins. This is actually the combination of the lesser and the pinstripe. So there's not really a slang name for the butter pinstripe combination, which is kind of interesting. You know, this is the kingpin. You would think it'd be like, I guess you could call it like the butter pin or something like that. So take a look at this. This is the butter pinstripe. Almost looks exactly like a kingpin. The kingpin and the butter pin, almost exactly the same. So take a look at this. One last thing I wanted to show you, and that is the price of the lesser versus the butter. So this is a lesser, and I actually pulled out kind of the high end of the price, you know, just the base gene, and they're selling for about $100, and then a lot of times you have like $50 shipping on top of it. Sometimes, I'd say usually at reptile shows, you can usually get single gene lessers and butters. I'd say anywhere from like usually between $80 and $120. Really depends on how many are at at the show. You know, if you have the only lesser in the whole place, usually you can mark it up a little. And then if there's like 20 other lessers that you're competing with at other tables, sometimes the prices are a little bit lower. So the lessers are about $100. And take a look at this. This is a butter. I pulled this up, and this is also $100. So they've been around for a long time, and this is probably pretty much like the bottom price that you can get for any single gene morph. I'd say, you know, the lessers and the butters, they're not going to go any lower than, you know, like $100 or something like that. So the real question is the butter the same as the lesser? And it's kind of interesting. I actually saw a reptile forum that kind of brought up this point, which I hadn't really considered before. And they said if you actually breed a butter to a normal that is really light, you'll end up with lighter colored butters. And if you breed it to a dark colored normal, you get dark normals. So a lot of people think that it's the influence of kind of the blank slate of the normal that you're breeding with, or kind of the like the blank canvas of what you're actually working with. And a lot of times if you actually take a butter and you breed it to something else that has some genes in the mix, you don't really know what the base, like the normal blank template is underneath that thing. And some people say that the butters and lessers can kind of be polymorphic, which means that if you actually take a butter and you breed it to something else, like a normal, you'll get half butters, but all the butters will be slightly different colors. Some of them will be brighter and some of them will be darker. Although pretty much from my experience, I produced a lot of lessers in my collection. It seems like most of the lessers are really bright and almost exactly the same color and intensity. So I'm not sure. It really depends on either the polymorphism, kind of the variability within the gene that you really can't control, or really the normals that you breed it to. So I would say, based on what I'm seeing here, as a matter of fact, if you ask me, is butter the same as the lesser, my final conclusion would be, I think they're actually different, the butter and the lesser. And kind of the reason I say that is if you actually look way back at the beginning over here, this is the brightest butter that I've seen, and there's not really a lesser that compares to the brightest butter. And kind of on the flip side, if you look at the darkest lesser, there's really not a butter that is as dark as the darkest lesser. And I think there is a lot of overlap. So you have this kind of a wide range of brightness in the butters and lessers, and potentially you could get a butter and a lesser that look exactly the same, but I don't think you could get a really bright butter and compare it to anything in the like with a lesser that's as bright, or get a really dark lesser and compare it to a really dark butter. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Brian Montgomery asks, I just bought a ball python that's a banana Mojave and it has blue eyes. Can just those two genes together result in a ball python that has blue eyes? As a matter of fact, you can actually tell what genes are in your snake a lot of times based on the color of the eyes. And I'd say when most people think of a blue-eyed ball python, most people think of a blue-eyed leucistic, which is an all-white snake with the blue eyes. And it's kind of interesting. I've actually seen certain combinations when you mix in just one gene of the blue-eyed leucistic actually result in blue eyes in your ball python. As a matter of fact, I actually have a lesser pied, which is an all-white snake with blue eyes, and even though it's not technically it's not considered a blue-eyed leucistic because it just has one copy of one of the genes in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. You really need two copies of the gene to be considered a blue-eyed leucistic, but even though it just has one copy of the lesser gene, it actually has blue eyes, which is kind of wild. As a matter of fact, if I actually handed someone that snake, they'd say, yeah, that is a blue-eyed leucistic, when in fact it's actually an all-white pied that has lesser in the mix. And I think it's the influence of just one copy of the lesser that changes the eye color to blue, which is pretty interesting. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.